Babylon, 323 BC. The most powerful man who has ever lived is dying in a room built for someone else's palace. And he is asking his generals a question none of them can answer. Not, who should rule after me? Not yet. He'll answer that one too eventually, with a coldness that will outlive him. Right now, he asks something stranger. He asks them to bring him his army, one soldier at a time, so he can look each man in the eye before he dies. 32 years old. He's conquered more of the known world than anyone in human history, before or since. And in his final hours, he isn't reaching for an heir, a wife, or a god. He's reaching for the only relationship he ever actually knew how to have. The one built on war. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the very thing that made Alexander unstoppable, an identity fused completely with conquest, was also the thing that tore him apart. This isn't a story about military genius, although he had that in a form barely seen since. It's a story about what happens to a person who is never once in his entire life allowed to simply be, only to become endlessly until becoming is the only self he has left. Alexander didn't lose his mind at the edges of the world. He ran out of a world large enough to keep telling him who he was. To understand what broke Alexander, you have to understand what built him. And it starts before he could walk. He was the son of two people who were in their own ways extraordinary and extraordinarily dangerous to be raised by. His father, Philip II, was the most capable military reformer Greece had produced in a generation, a man who had turned a backward Macedonian kingdom into the most feared fighting force on the continent. Philip did not love easily, and he did not love simply. He measured his son, constantly, publicly. And Alexander grew up inside that measurement, aware from an early age that his father's approval was a moving target he might never fully hit. His mother, Olympias, gave him something different and in its own way just as dangerous, the conviction that he was not merely Philip's son. She told him, repeatedly, insistently, that his true father was Zeus himself, that he was descended from Achilles, that his birth was accompanied by omens no ordinary child receives. It's the ancient version of telling your kid he's the most special boy who has ever lived. No exceptions, ever. Except this particular kid grew up to have an army. Whether Olympias believed it or was constructing it deliberately barely matters. What matters is that Alexander grew up receiving two competing instructions about his own identity. You must prove yourself worthy from his father, and you already are extraordinary divine, chosen from his mother. Think about what it does to a child to be told, in the same household, that he has to earn everything and that he was already born as something more than human. There is no stable resting place inside that contradiction. There is only forward motion, because forward motion is the only thing that can temporarily resolve it. Then came Aristotle. For roughly 3 years, the greatest living philosopher in the Greek world personally tutored the teenage Alexander, not just in rhetoric and science, but in Homer, in the Iliad specifically. Alexander reportedly slept with an annotated copy of it under his pillow for the rest of his life. And the figure inside it he fixated on wasn't Odysseus, the clever survivor. It was Achilles, the warrior who was explicitly told he could have a long, comfortable, forgettable life, or a short, blazing, immortal one. Achilles chose glory over longevity. Alexander appears to have made the same choice before he ever commanded a single soldier. By 18, he had already led the decisive cavalry charge at the Battle of Chaeronea that helped break the allied Greek forces and secure Macedonian dominance. He wasn't observing war. He was already inside it, already proving something, already ahead of schedule for a life that demanded he outrun the terms his parents had set for him. But here's where it gets darker, because the next event in his life is the one that actually starts the machine that will eventually consume him. In 336 BC, Philip II is assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. The full truth of who orchestrated it has never been settled. Ancient sources point fingers in several directions, including, uncomfortably, toward Olympias herself. What is certain is that Alexander, 20 years old, inherits the throne of Macedon almost overnight, in a kingdom surrounded by enemies who assume a 20-year-old will be easy to remove. He answers that assumption with ruthless speed, securing his throne, crushing revolts across Greece and razing the city of Thebes so completely that its destruction becomes a message to every city that might consider testing him again. Then, in 334 BC, he crosses into the Persian Empire, the largest, wealthiest, most powerful empire on Earth. With an army a fraction of the size Persia can field, and according to Plutarch, he does it having given away nearly all of his personal land and property to his officers before he left. When his general Perdiccas asked what he had kept for himself, his answer was one word: hope. This is the first clear signal of the pattern that will define his entire life. Alexander does not accumulate security. He burns it deliberately so that there is no path backward, only forward, into the next act of becoming. What follows is one of the most astonishing military campaigns in recorded history. At Issus in 333 BC, Alexander, outnumbered more than 2-1, reads the terrain, funnels Darius's much larger force into a narrow coastal plain where numbers stop mattering, and personally leads the cavalry charge that breaks the Persian line. Darius flees the field, leaving his own mother, wife, and children behind in the captured camp. Alexander's response becomes part of the myth instantly. He treats them not as prisoners, but as guests befitting royalty, magnanimous. Also unmistakably a performance proof broadcast across the empire that he doesn't just defeat kings, he outclasses them. Tyre is next, an island city, walls rising straight out of the sea, considered by nearly everyone, including his own officers, effectively unconquerable. Alexander is offered peace. He refuses it. For 7 months, he builds a causeway across open water to reach walls no army has ever breached from that angle, loses men daily to arrows and collapsing timber, and takes the city anyway. The pattern is crystallizing in real time. Offered a reasonable, acceptable outcome, Alexander chooses the harder, costlier one, because the story he's building about himself has no room in it for acceptable. Egypt falls without a fight. A population exhausted by Persian rule welcomes him as a liberator. The priests declare him the son of Amun, a living god. He crosses punishing desert to the oracle at Siwa specifically to have this confirmed, and what was said to him there, he apparently never fully repeated to anyone. Whatever it was, it deepened something already present since childhood. Not simply confidence, but a growing conviction that ordinary human categories, mortal, subject, limited, no longer fully apply to him. Darius has learned from Issus by the time they meet again at Gaugamela, 331 BC. He picks flat, open ground specifically so his numbers, several times Alexander's by most estimates, can finally count. The night before, Alexander's general Parmenion urges a surprise night attack as the only way to offset it. Alexander refuses. He wants a clean daylight win in full view with no room for anyone to later claim he'd won through trickery. He sleeps so soundly the morning of the battle that his officers have to wake him. Most people lie awake the night before something that actually matters, a job interview, a wedding, a court date. This man is about to face the largest army he has ever seen in his life, and he sleeps like a baby. That isn't calm. That's a man who has fused himself so completely with winning that losing isn't a thought he even knows how to think. He drives straight for Darius's position, forcing the Persian king to flee a second time. And with that flight, the largest empire the world has ever seen effectively ends in an afternoon. One by one, the empire hands itself over. Babylon opens its gates. Susa surrenders its treasury. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, gets something else. In a choice that split opinion for 2,000 years, part message, part drunken impulse, Alexander puts it to the torch. By 25, he has done what should have taken a dynasty. Philip's shadow isn't matched, it's obliterated, and this is exactly the moment you'd expect the story to slow down. It doesn't, because the thing driving Alexander was never defeat Persia. Persia was simply the largest available target. When your identity depends on the next conquest, running out of enemies doesn't produce peace. It produces a search for a new list. That search drags him into Bactria and Sogdia, chasing guerrilla resistance through mountains no army wanted to be in. And it's here, far from any real battlefield, that the first genuine crack in Alexander shows. At a drunken banquet in 328 BC, his old friend Clytus, the man who once saved his life in combat, mocks his growing obsession with divine status and accuses him of disrespecting Philip's real achievements to inflate his own myth. Alexander grabs a spear from a guard and kills him on the spot. not an enemy, not a battlefield. A friend over a joke that landed too close to true. The same conviction that just conquered an empire, that he answers to no ordinary rule, has started pointing inward at the people closest to him. That's not a new problem showing up. It's the same one, finding a new target. None of it slows him down. If anything, it accelerates. In 327 BC, Alexander pushes his army into India, further east than any Macedonian force has ever gone, further than most of his own men believed was rational. They fight the savage battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus, whom Alexander, in a gesture that reveals exactly how he thought about conquest, allows to keep his kingdom afterward, not out of mercy alone, but because Porus fought like the kind of king Alexander respected. Even in defeat, Porus becomes part of the myth Alexander is building about himself. I don't just conquer men. I recognize greatness when I meet it, because I am the standard against which greatness is measured. Then, at the Hyphasis River, something happens that had never happened to Alexander before. His army refuses to go further. Years of campaigning. Monsoon rains that hadn't stopped for weeks. Men who had followed him 8,000 kilometers from home now stand in the mud and simply will not take another step east. Alexander tries everything he knows, appeals to glory, to legacy, to the Achilles ideal that had organized his entire life. For the first time, it doesn't work. This is worth sitting with. Clytus was a crack, something breaking loose from inside him. This is different. His whole identity ran on a simple engine: set an impossible goal, achieve it, become slightly more than human in the process, then find the next impossible goal. At the Hyphasis, for the first time, the engine hits a wall it cannot burn through. Not an enemy, not a terrain feature, but the simple human limit of his own men's exhaustion. He reportedly retreats to his tent for 3 days, refusing to speak to anyone. When he emerges, he agrees to turn back. But the sources are unanimous that this reads less like diplomacy and more like a wound. He had never lost. He had just for the first time been stopped. And then, in what many historians consider one of the strangest and most self-destructive decisions of his life, Alexander chooses to march the army home through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most punishing environments on Earth, rather than take known, safer routes. By Arrian's account, the reason wasn't ignorance of the danger. It was that only one commander in legend, the Queen Semiramis, was said to have crossed it before him and survived, and he wanted to be the one who actually did. Having been denied the conquest he wanted at the Hyphasis, Alexander manufactures a new trial to survive, as though he cannot tolerate simply returning without first being tested again. Thousands of soldiers, along with camp followers, die in that desert. By some estimates, more than were lost in every battle of the campaign combined. This is the moment worth sitting with, because it's the whole story in miniature. Alexander could have gone home a living legend, already accomplished beyond any measure available to him. Instead, denied one form of conquest, he manufactured another, because rest was never actually available to him. Not the world stopped giving him things to conquer. He had, quite literally, run out of a world large enough to keep proving what his childhood had trained him to spend his entire life proving. Back from India, Alexander does something that alienates the very men who built his empire with him. At Susa, he stages mass weddings, marrying himself and dozens of his officers to Persian noblewomen, and begins adopting Persian court customs, forcing men to prostrate themselves before him in a ritual called proskynesis, a custom his Macedonian officers find degrading, almost blasphemous, when demanded of free Greek men. To Alexander, this likely wasn't betrayal of his Macedonian identity. It was expansion of it. An attempt to become something bigger than Macedonian or Persian, a fused ruler of a fused world, because a merely Macedonian king was no longer a big enough container for who he had become in his own mind. But to the men around him, it read as a man who had started to believe, quite literally, that he was no longer entirely one of them. The resentment boils over at Opis later that year. Alexander announces he's discharging his aging Macedonian veterans and sending them home with generous pay, and in the same breath that he's folding Persian soldiers into the army's core ranks, roles that had always belonged to Macedonians alone. His own men don't hear generosity, they hear replacement. They shout that he should discharge all of them and go conquer the world with his father Zeus, since he clearly doesn't need Macedonians anymore. Alexander's answer isn't diplomacy. He has the ringleaders arrested and executed on the spot in front of the entire assembly. Then he locks himself away for 2 days, refusing to see anyone. The same withdrawal he showed at the hyphasis, until his own soldiers, terrified of losing him, break down outside his tent begging forgiveness. He stages a mass reconciliation banquet and forgives them publicly. But look at what actually happened. The men who had earned the right to speak to him as equals had to beg for his attention, and he let them. Then, in 324 BC, Hephaestion, his closest companion since childhood, possibly the one relationship in Alexander's adult life that wasn't structured entirely around hierarchy and conquest, dies suddenly, likely from illness. Alexander's grief is, by every account, close to unhinged. He has the treating physician executed, cuts his own hair in mourning in the Homeric style of Achilles grieving Patroclus, and orders an entire enemy tribe, the Chossaeans, slaughtered as what one source calls a sacrifice to Hephaestion's memory. This isn't simply grief. This is a man who has never once in his entire life been taught how to lose someone without going to war over it. Conquest is the only language he has ever had for pain. So conquest is what he reaches for now, even though this time, for the first time, it can't actually fix anything. Within a year, back in Babylon, Alexander himself is dead, likely from illness, though poison and other causes have been debated for 2,000 years and probably always will be. 32 years old, an empire stretching from Greece to India and no clearly designated heir. When his generals ask him, as he lies dying, to whom the empire should pass, his answer in the version of the story that's outlived every other is chilling in its accuracy: to the strongest. Within a matter of years, that empire tears itself apart in a decades-long war between his former generals, precisely as his deathbed answer predicted. The thing Alexander built could not survive him because it was never actually a structure. It was an extension of one man's identity. And when that identity died, so did the thing it had built. Here is the uncomfortable question underneath all of this. Alexander is usually remembered as a story about ambition, about how far a single human being can push the limits of what's achievable. But that reading misses what's actually going on underneath. Alexander's ambition wasn't the engine, it was the symptom. The engine was an identity that had never been allowed to simply exist without earning its right to exist. Built by a father who measured him constantly, a mother who told him he was already more than human, and a philosophical education that handed him a hero who chose a short, blazing life over a long, ordinary one. That engine does not know how to idle. It only knows how to seek the next target. And when a person's sense of self depends entirely on the next achievement, running out of achievements available isn't peace. It's an emergency. Alexander didn't stop conquering because he found contentment. He didn't stop until his body physically stopped him. Alexander never found out what came after winning. He ran out of world before he ever had to answer the question. You don't get that excuse. Think about the version of this running quietly in your own life. The promotion that was supposed to finally feel like enough and didn't. The goal that once hit immediately got replaced by a bigger one, before you'd even let yourself feel the first one land. If you got everything you're currently chasing all of it, tomorrow, would you know who you were the morning after?